everyone, my name is Cassie Feld, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Upcycled Adulting, where I am always working to help you grow to accomplish your goals, overcome obstacles, and create healthy habits so that you can create the life you've been dreaming of, because you do deserve it and you can have it. Today, I'm going to be talking about boundaries, and this is my first in a series about boundaries. This is actually about creating boundaries. Now, I want to just start right off the bat by letting you know that just because you've created a boundary doesn't mean you have to communicate it. When we talk about boundaries, and I will be following this in this series, creating boundaries, communicating boundaries, and reinforcing boundaries. But I think it's really important to know that you can actually pull that communication part out if you feel safest that way. So, for anyone out there who's been like, the idea of creating boundaries and having to tell people just is so cringy to me, and I'm so uncomfortable, and I'm so fearful of the potential conflict or rejection that I may face if I start creating boundaries in my relationships and telling people that I have these boundaries, it's okay. Today, we're just going to talk about trying our hand at creating boundaries and getting a feel for that. What does that actually feel like for us? And how can we make that a part of our lives in a way that we feel really safe with? If you grew up in a family that's similar to mine, you may have gone through your entire life feeling like you weren't allowed to have boundaries. You may actually, like me, have experienced the feeling that no one had boundaries. So, I very much felt like there was a rigidity about how everyone was expected to act and what everyone was expected to do. I felt very parentified. I felt very responsible for everyone else's feelings, but I also felt like there were no real boundaries, right? There were very few boundaries. I mean, my mom had this boundary that no one was ever allowed to talk about money. But other than that, there were very, very few boundaries. And I think that that's just kind of like an old school, it's rude to talk about politics and religion and money. I think it was more like that. But creating actual boundaries when you grow up in that environment is so unfamiliar. And in fact, you may even be confused about what a boundary is and how a boundary works. And so this might also be creating an issue. So the first thing I'm going to say about what a boundary is and how it works is that a boundary is for you. So it's important to know that you don't have to communicate your boundaries because the boundary is actually for you. We tend to think of boundaries as a way of changing the behavior of others or influencing the behavior of others. And really, that's not what it's about at all. A boundary is really about creating some parameters or guidelines. I like to think of it as a standard by which I actually behave in my relationships, a standard of what I'm willing to be present for or engage in. It is simply a standard. Okay. Now, I went through most of my life. I would say I was in my mid to late 40s before I created any boundaries related to me. Now I have lots of them. I'm happy to share them. If anyone is like, I could use some ideas about boundaries because I'm not really sure where to start, let me know. I'm happy to do a video about that for those of you who are a little nervous about creating boundaries. But when I create boundaries, I also create the idea of how will I handle that? How will I actually navigate that? And in a lot of ways that helps me really analyze whether or not I'm comfortable with my own boundary, right? So I have a boundary. For example, one of the first boundaries I created is no one's allowed to hit me. I know that that might sound really silly, and you might be like, wait a minute, did she just say you didn't create boundaries till your mid 40s and one of them was nobody's allowed to hit me? Yes, that is correct. Because when I say no one's allowed to hit me, I mean no one. Okay. I'm not comfortable with people hitting me or being physical with me. And that includes children. I know. And that includes other people's children. I will not stay engaged in a situation where someone else's child is hitting me. I'm not okay with that. Now, I have read all kinds of things in gentle parenting about self control and children hitting and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I am not okay with it. I don't have to explain that. I don't need anybody to validate that. I don't need you to agree with it. Y'all can comment until the cows come home about how it's a normal developmental phase for children to hit. And I'm still going to say I have a boundary that I do not allow myself to be hit. That's it. You're not going to change my mind. Okay. Go ahead, comment away, but you're not going to change my mind. I don't allow myself to be hit by other people. When I try to reinforce that boundary or I try to act on that boundary, right? Because obviously I cannot make a 2-year-old never hit me, correct? Okay. My saying to a 3-year-old, you can't hit me does not mean that they're not going to hit me. However, it might mean that I'm going to step away, right? I'm not going to harm the child for those of you who are like, how are you reinforced? But I am going to step away. I am going to not be present to be hit. Okay. That's just the reality of that situation. So, really, when we think about our boundaries, it's more about what are we going to be present for? What are we going to engage in? What are we going to entertain in our own lives? This is not about this person's no longer allowed to do that. Okay. So I can say, I have a boundary that I'm not comfortable with people yelling at me. I do not tolerate people yelling at me. And so if a conversation is getting to this place where I'm being yelled at, I'm just going to say, "Hey, look, I'm not going to be yelled at. So I'm going to step away until things cool down and then we can have this conversation because I'm not going to be present for being yelled at." Okay. Now, obviously, in that situation, I have created a boundary, communicated a boundary, and am willing to enforce that boundary by actually walking away. That would be the whole process, right? But in the inception, I created a lot of boundaries. When I first started thinking about boundaries, at first, it was really, really hard, right? I was like, it's really hard for me to think about boundaries. Okay. Then I was like, "Ooh, I could have a boundary about all of this. Like, I could have all the boundaries and I could have it all be just how I like it." But the reality of the situation is, and that's okay, y'all. That's okay. Because as we go through this process and I start talking about, okay, so that's your boundary, right? So are you going to communicate the boundary? Yes or no? We're going to decide that. If so, how would you communicate that boundary? And how would you enforce that boundary, right? How are you going to make sure that this is a consistent thing that you are consistent about for yourself, right? That you're going to modify your behavior to honor your boundary in what way? And sometimes you're like, oops, wait, can't do that. Okay. Oops, wait, can't do that. And when I say I didn't create boundaries to myself for myself until I was in my mid 40s, one of the things that helped me create those boundaries was that I did have existing boundaries. I just didn't recognize them as boundaries. Okay. There are certain things that I was always like, I will not be present for that. I'm not entertaining that nonsense. Okay. There have always been certain things where I'm like, I will not stand by and watch that happen. All right. I will modify my behavior because I will not stand by and watch it happen. And many times in my life where I have done that. Right. And for those of you, for example, you may say, this is a great example of this. For those of you who really um, are engaged in conversation about um, oppression of people and who are like, I would not stand by for someone being bullied or for someone being oppressed in some way or for off color jokes or for, right, to actually have a boundary in which you are willing to say, yo, not cool. Like, whoa, not cool. Okay, and to step out of that situation or to get help or to intervene because you will not stand idly. You have a boundary. Okay. You have a boundary. You already have one. Your boundary is that is not allowed in my presence. Okay. And I have always had those boundaries, but having understanding that those were boundaries was really helpful for me because then I was like, oh, okay. Yes, those are very socially acceptable boundaries by the whole. Those are relatively socially acceptable boundaries. Might not be socially acceptable for me to say I won't be hit by your 3-year-old, but I can still say it. Okay, no matter how much times change. Might not be socially acceptable to say that I have a boundary about certain things that go on with, for example, my mother-in-law or my mother, right? A lot of times as children, we're taught that we're not allowed to have boundaries with our parents or with our parent in-laws, right? That we're not allowed to say, hey, yeah, that's a no. Okay. Nope, not down for that. Okay. And so when we get into a space where we say, I'm going to adjust my behavior because this is my boundary's about me, my boundary's not about you. Okay. I like to say, I like to say that the concept of boundaries is kind of a try me concept. Okay. In some cases, it really is because in some cases, you're not going to communicate your boundaries, but you're like, try me. Okay. Not today. I'm not today, and I'm never the one. All right. In certain circumstances, not today. I'm never the one. There are places where you say, okay, I have a boundary about that. Maybe I need to communicate that. Maybe that's a change. And people need to know that. There are places where you just simply say, okay, you've shown me who you are. I believe you. You will not you will not honor the boundaries that I have. And for that reason, I'm going to make the choice to alter my behavior based on that knowledge now. Okay. I'm not going to threaten you. I'm not going to say to you, um, you must do it my way. Right. But I may say, you know what, if this is not something that we can come to terms on, if you will, and by the way, we do this all the time as parents in particular, we do this a lot where we say, if you do not respect my boundary regarding my child, we'll be going home. Okay. We will not, if you don't respect my boundary regarding my child, we will not be coming around in some cases. This is a thing that happens. And so this is not a threat. This is not well, I have a boundary about that, so you must do what I say. And I know that this feels very nuanced. This is my behavior will be modified because of this boundary. My response, my response to this is going to be shaped by the fact that I have a boundary here. Okay. This doesn't mean that we can't rethink our boundaries. This doesn't mean we can't adjust our boundaries. We are allowed to do that. When we're creating our boundaries, I think it's really important to be mindful of change. And part of the reason is I know when I first started off creating boundaries, I really struggled a lot with feeling like it was a bait and switch, feeling like it was unfair. Okay. To create boundaries. So I was like, well, I've allowed this for a really long time. And so it's unfair for me to create a boundary here. Like I have also engaged in gossiping. So creating a boundary that I don't want to engage in gossiping anymore feels really unfair. Like I'm changing the rules of the relationship, and that's not fair and that's not allowed. And while we may want to consider giving some time for the other person to adjust when there's been a change in your boundary or your dynamic or what's happening in the relationship or what the expectation is, it is actually completely fine to make a change. As Maya Angelou says, when we know better, we do better, right? And so I now know better. I now know that, or I now feel that this is not benign, and I now feel uncomfortable engaging in it. And so I'm going to simply say, oh, you know what? This isn't really a conversation I'm comfortable with. So I'm going to step out of the conversation, right? This Notice that I just said that. That doesn't mean you have to change the subject because I don't like the conversation that's going on with these three people. It's just a matter of saying, when that conversation comes up, I'm either going to quietly walk away or I'm going to say, oh, I'm really not comfortable with this, or, oh, I don't really want to engage in this. And I'm just going to excuse myself. This isn't about controlling their behavior. This is about creating a boundary. Okay. So when we think about creating boundaries, one of the really important things to do is to think about the fact that we don't create boundaries with the intention of controlling the behavior of another person. We're creating boundaries to create a standard by which we want to live, show up, engage. Okay. We are creating that standard for our own selves. And when we get into the nitty gritty of do we or don't we communicate boundaries? How do we or don't we communicate boundaries? And we get into the nitty gritty of enforcing or following through with our boundaries, is the better way of saying it. When we get into the space of how do we follow through with our boundaries, it's okay if we're like, oh, I mean, maybe that's a boundary I wanna have, but, like, right now, I don't really wanna follow up on that boundary. Like, that's no fun, okay? Like, yeah, I mean, I think that in my mind, it would be great to have a boundary that is about I don't, engage in gossip, right? But like, I don't wanna walk out of every, like, lunch that I have with my 5 friends who we spend most of our time gossiping. Like, I don't want to do that right now. I'm not ready. I haven't created that. But if you know that you want to create a boundary around something and you're just not ready to follow up on it, you also know that you can start pivoting to a space where that boundary is clear in your life. Oh my goodness, that's a real thing. Okay. You can actually start pivoting. You can actually start moving toward the future you that has that boundary, right? That is like, you know what? I'm not going to flip this like a switch. I think I'm going to gradually layer this in. I'm going to move to a space where this feels more natural as my boundary because that really is the boundary I'd like to have. Okay. Now, aside from the boundaries that we create that dictate how we show up for other people, okay, I'm just gonna hand y'all this one. On a side note of this, I like to create a speaking pattern in which I say, I have a healthy, loving boundary for myself. Okay. I create boundaries for myself, meaning for the way I conduct myself when I am alone, for the way that I conduct myself in my day to day life, regardless of anybody else, not involving my relationships with everybody else. We tend to think of boundaries as only existing in our relationships with other people, but there are boundaries that exist for you. Okay. I have a healthy, loving boundary for myself. Not, and by the way, I've moved away from saying rule because when we use the word rule, what we're saying is you can't do that or you must do that. And when we create rules, one is that they're very rigid, and two is that they tend to create a phenomenon in which as soon as you say it's a rule I can't, then you want to. Okay, that's just a real thing. But when you say I've created a healthy, loving boundary with myself, it is a definite shift. So I have a really close friend, one of my best friends is a personal trainer. And we were talking one time and I was talking about her high degree of self-discipline. This is, in my early, I'm going to manipulate my body days. And I was like, I just don't know how you're self-disciplined. Like, I don't know how you do that. Like, how do you just live by like you can't have french fries and you can't have, cheesecake and you can't, right? And you have to work out. And she said, I don't live like that at all. I can have all the french fries I want. I just choose not to. I just don't. I don't have to work out. I get to work out. Changing the vernacular is a really, really powerful thing because what she's saying is she has boundaries. She has healthy, loving boundaries for herself about how she nourishes her body. Okay. She has a boundary about fueling her body well. It does not mean that she can't ever have cheesecake. She still eats cheesecake occasionally. She just has created a boundary on which cheesecake isn't part of her daily life, right? When we reframe this to be a space of boundaries are about how I conduct myself. Boundaries create a space of conducting myself in a way in which I am proud of myself, or at least I am minimizing regret. I'm showing up in a way that aligns with who I authentically am and who I want to be. Okay. That's what a boundary does. And so, whether that boundary is for you or that boundary is for other people, creating it is simply creating a standard of truth for you, a standard of this is what I'm about. These are my values. This is how I show up in my values. These are the things I do and don't do because those are my values. That simple. So we don't need to overthink this and overcomplicate this. And we can take some of the pressure out, and also just coming to a space where we say, this isn't set in stone. Okay. Whatever you determine to be boundaries you need right now, that's not set in stone. Okay. It does not need to be rigid. Boundaries absolutely can be assessed and reassessed and changed and eliminated and created. This is not a wall. Okay. It's not on a hard electric fence that you're creating here. Okay. It's a little bit more like a net, like a flexible net, where you are making some decisions about what's going to come through and what's not going to come through. Right. And there's some flexibility there. So don't be afraid to create boundaries. Think about the things that you need in your life to help you show up the best you can. That's where your boundaries lie. Do not forget to subscribe. This is part 1 of a 3-part series on boundaries. You don't want to ever miss a thing. We're always talking about the best ways to create your best life, because you are amazing and you deserve to live the life that you've been dreaming of. You can live that life. You can bring that into your everyday real life. I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.